Anyone looking for set recommendations will stumble across a lot of different opinions and guides on how to make a meta set, and which skills are strongest for Switch Axe. It can all be very confusing for less experienced players, especially with Sunbreak's absurd augment and charm system and Monster Hunter's tradition of not explaining skills properly. Those amongst you who do know what they're doing, however, have probably looked around and seen some very questionable recommendations for meta sets. There is a great deal of misinformation going around, particularly with Switch Axe set building. As an example, I'll be reviewing the meta guide by Eastern Jackdaw, which is pinned in a Sunbreak meta sets compilation on the Monster Hunter meta subreddit. First up, we have this skill priority list. Scrolling through this, what immediately strikes me is Protective Polish being listed here as Switch Axe tags. If you do not want to use Protective Polish, you should really consider if you want to use Switch Axe after all. This immediately signals to me that the guide is gonna be shit. Protective Polish was a necessity in Base Rise and early Sunbreak due to restrictive set building, but at this point, it's just a massive pain in the ass. If you run Protective Polish, you have to stop and sharpen every 90 seconds or so, or risk losing approximately 7% of your damage from dropping from purple to white sharpness. This is fine if your hunt takes 2 minutes, but is incredibly inconvenient in longer anomaly investigations, particularly ones with multiple monsters which can go over 10 minutes. That requires you to sharpen 6 to 7 times. Furthermore, nowhere on this list is a single wirebug skill. Switch Axe's counter, like it or not, is one of its strongest options, and whilst the wirebug cooldown is relatively quick, you get way more uptime and comfort having 3 wirebugs buffed by Wind Mantle rather than just 2 refreshing at the base rate. For many telegraph moves, EBC is the highest damage response, and having more opportunities to use EBC makes the set stronger to an extent that calculations can't effectively quantify. These points are the crux of my argument as to why this and so many other meta set guides are bad. They seem like they only care for the spreadsheet numbers on theoretical combos and don't translate well into actual gameplay. Going through the rest of this list, having Evade Extender 1 as comfort tax is questionable. I admit that I'm an Evade Extender hater and play exclusively in its absence, but this skill is by no means a 100% necessary skill tax, and should probably be listed as a preference thing. Telling players it makes positioning much better is misleading because it's subjective. But from my own subjective experiences, good players with good positioning rarely use Evade Extender. With stun resistance, if you get hit enough to need this, well, that's rough. Intricate Heart here is the actually good comfort skill. Speed sharpening I assume is important here because apparently you must use Protective Polish, but if you see later in this guide, the sets use a 4 slot entirely dedicated to speed sharpening, which is pretty inefficient. All these other skills are useful enough, but the priority is messed up. Weakness exploit being in the 3rd highest priority tier, crit boost being in the 3rd lowest, having jumped up apparently, and crit eye near the bottom of the barrel below agitator is absurd. On paper alone, affinity contributes as much to raw damage as attack boost does, because even though your files don't crit, your sword and axe hits still can, and they do more damage than your files do. But beyond this is the fact that Affinity enables stuff like proper sharpness management through Master's Touch, or Crit Element, whilst the only synergy Attack Boost has is with Powder Mantle damage. But wait, there is no Powder Mantle on the skill priority list, which is another very bad sign. Powder Mantle 1 takes 30 hits to activate on Switch Axe, which shouldn't take long with Amp. Even if I'm being conservative and estimating it taking 30 seconds to activate, which when amped is like hitting 1 swing every 2 seconds. Then another 20 seconds for it to go from its passive orange buff to its active blue buff. That's 1 Powder Mantle pop you're getting per 50 seconds. With these pops doing over 500 damage, it's like an extra 10 DPS. This doesn't sound that big when I say it, but if you're doing 200 DPS in a hunt, which is a very respectable number, that's 5% extra damage for 1 skill point. Even when I'm speedrunning, I'm doing like 350 DPS on special investigations, and proccing Powder Mantle once every 40 seconds or so because I'm hitting the monster quite a lot. That 1 skill point contributes like 4% of my total damage, which is incredibly efficient. Lastly, on the bottom of this list, Power Prolonger. That's a bit silly to me because Amp contributes so much damage and even I can't always maintain constant Amp in multiplayer hunts. So, onto Rampage skills. Only File Switch Boost is relevant. I have tested Element Bane in casual gameplay and in speedruns. That conditional 15% more element damage is huge, but it's still not worth it. On a spreadsheet, it will definitely give you more damage for set combos, but having to actually manage sword gauge makes every aspect of your gameplay more difficult. And in practicality, it leads to less damage because you won't always be able to use your strongest options and combos. And this little comment stating that as of TU5 this is worse regarding anti-species versus PSB is absolutely insane to me. The damage differential on paper between anti-species and PSB has always been tiny and absolutely not worth the lost utility. I checked the previous version of this guide and it actually recommended anti-species over Foul Switch Boost. Having negative sword gauge sustain severely limits the morphs you can do and how often you can counter or ZSD. This forces you to use a bunch of weak 2-stage combos or, god forbid, run Switch Charger instead of EBC, which is a huge damage loss. If you still feel like using Element Bane, I won't stop you, but it is not the meta option. Any good Switch Axe player or speedrunner runs Foul Switch Boost. I don't mean to say that Foul Switch Boost is exclusively a sweaty speedrunner thing though. Typical speedrun options involve less comfort in exchange for more damage, whilst Foul Switch Boost is just superior in both comfort and damage. So with switch skills, everyone talks shit about / or the shit poke as many people call it. I exclusively use this switch skill and almost never use forward overhead slash, but it's entirely preference and both do have use cases, and I find it silly that forward slash is so often dismissed entirely. Realistically, both of these moves are rarely used anyway. When I do use forward slash, it's because I made a huge mistake in sword gauge management and can't freely morph, so I just forward slash and transition into a 2-stage to regen gauge. Compressed finishing discharge, however, is functionally useless, and I'm very surprised at the recommendation of Switch Charger into CFD combo, because this is a terribly weak and slow combo that only works on immobile monsters, and just using your normal morph combo, even when not amped, is better damage. What I find most puzzling in this section is the recommendation of using Switch Charger on element files, and EBC on power files. If you scroll down a little, the guide doesn't recommend using power files ever, and above, it clearly said to disregard power prolonger since you have EBC. I suspected this section hadn't been updated for a couple of title updates, but it actually had been changed recently. Weird. Nonetheless, EBC has been the stronger option since base Sunbreak. The Switch Charger recommendation may be because the sets cripple themselves by running Element Bane Rampage Echoes, and therefore have major sword gauge issues. In reality, using Switch Charger as a band-aid solution then gimps you in the damage department, because EBC is the strongest response to many telegraph moves a monster can do, and losing amp on element file, no matter how quick it is to regain with sword combos, is still a massive drop in DPS compared to having constant amp from EBC, plus the big damage EBC does itself. What is the point of maximizing damage in a spreadsheet, but not during an actual hunt? Now to actually look at the sets presented in this guide. As with many other Switch Axe set guides, there is a fixation on maxing element and attack values, which is logical, but then basically ignoring proper affinity and sharpness upkeep, which is not logical. Dragon conversion is very expensive, but these sets also seem to have mandatory evade extender 1 and stun resistance 3, so they have been nerfed for it. The fire set is stuck on crit boost 2 and early exploit 2, the water set is on crit boost 2 and early exploit 1, the thunder set is on crit boost 3 thankfully, but only early exploit 1, the ice set is on crit boost 2 and early exploit 2, and even the dragon set with Silver Slash's massive slots is stuck on early exploit 2 only. I basically already covered all the issues with these sets when I ran through the skill priority list, so I won't go on another rant about how protective polish is shit, or how there's no powder mantle, or how there's no wirebug skills, or how absurd it is to be dedicating a 4 slot to speed sharpening and a 2 slot to evade extender when you're only running at crit boost 2 and element exploit 2 on half the sets, or how you really should be using Foul Switch Boost. But I can point you to a better dragon conversion set, or alternatively, a Mail of Hellfire set that actually has wirebug skills, in my latest set guide linked in the description. But, moving on, notice here in this guide that it claims power files and raw builds are useless now. I'm not surprised they think this if the only raw build here is exhaust file, Opening up the matchup guide, I see that monsters like the Magdamalos, Duratodus, the Kushalas, the Zinogres, Astalos, and Ragna and Nawa are listed as elemental matchups. This is wrong. Status power files or Amazu Switch-Axe will outperform here, and at the risk of referencing speedruns, these monsters are run exclusively with raw sets using power files. Delving into this matchup list more, I see some very strange recommendations that I believe would stem from a lack of actual matchup experience. Apart from Elembane Ravage Deckers being recommended everywhere, I've already stated multiple times why this is not the best option, some of these notes, for example, using Elembane to focus 4 legs on Chameleos and Risen Chameleos, are misleading. Anyone who has experience hunting Chameleos knows that the hit zone data websites are wrong when they say Enraged Chameleos has a 25 element hit zone on 4 legs. For whatever reason, it always stays at 20. Also interesting is that it mentions hind legs for Risen Chameleos but not normal Chameleos, even though they have the same hit zones. The notes for Gold Raytheon, Duratodus, and Garangorm are just ignorant of the amount of time these monsters spend in specific states. You will only be hitting the broken incandescent head for like 10 to 15% of a Gold Rathian hunt, and thus Elembane is basically never worth it. Most funny to me are these ones. Magma Armadron if focusing head, forearms, and tail. Seething Basilgoose if focusing head and tail. Wind Serpent Ibushi if focusing head, back, front arms, and tail tip. They seem to imply that you ever have the chance to or would even want to hit anywhere else in these monsters. But overall, this matchup chart seems to be like purely theoretically based on hit zones, which for most monsters it works out fine, but if you have no actual matchup experience on certain monsters with different stage changes, then some of these recommendations can be quite misleading. So in summary, the sets in this guide do not factor in a lot of variables that directly impact your gameplay experience, in terms of both comfort and practical DPS. If you want a set that is strong while still being accessible and easy to use, don't make a set that relies on Protected Polish and runs Elembane instead of File Switch Boost. I was originally going to go through a bunch of other set guides in just as much detail, but looking across them, I found that they were all basically the same. Ifrit Gaming and Yokai Nox were 2 set creators who had made TU5 or TU6 endgame Switch-Axe sets that relied on the same basic ingredients as this Reddit guide: Dragon Conversion, Furious, and Protective Polish. Ifrit's guide does go for 100% affinity, which is good, and he has a separate Mail of Hellfire Dereliction Strife set, which is also good, but both these sets still run Protective Polish despite reaching 100% affinity. For his Mail of Hellfire set, if he dropped all 4 levels of attack boost and all 3 levels of Protective Polish, and added 2 Element Exploit, 2 Handicraft, and 3 Master's Touch in their place, it would be a good set. Yokai Nox's first set is pretty similar to the MH Meta one, except he adds recovery up to as if Bloodrite 2 isn't sufficient, and has Evade Extender 2, which I personally and subjectively hate. I do like that he appreciates Power Prolonger, but having only 1 burst and 1 element exploit is painful. This is somewhat rectified in his upgraded version, but it's still quite inefficient and still needs Protected Polish. His build option 2 looks like a Dereliction Strife set, but the easy version is stuck on Strife 2, Crit Boost 2, Burst 1 and Element Exploit 1. Worst of all, it's on Protective Polish 2. These are all kind of fixed in the upgraded version, but yeah, Protective Polish. Our old friend Fox Invictus also has a super sweaty modded set that adds Dereliction and Strife on top of Dragon Conversion and Furious, but despite the absurd augments and the tagline of insane crazy super omega damage set, it's still somehow unable to reach 100% affinity or escape Protective Polish hell. He actually intentionally augments Crit Eye off his set, which is hilarious, and of course he also needs Evade Extender 2. I have absolutely no clue why with modded augments he's stuck on Element Exploit 1 and Burst 1, it's incredibly fucking stupid. There are Wirebug skills, but the wrong ones. He runs Wirebug Whisperer 3, Wind Mantle 1 and Frenzied Bloodlust. but having 0 or 1 Wirebug Whisperer and instead stacking more levels of Frenzy Bloodlust would be much more effective. So for the final time, I will say this in the simplest terms.
Protective Polish bad.
If a meta guide uses Protective Polish, then the meta guide is bad. If the meta guide tells you to use Rampage decos other than File Switch Boost, the meta guide is bad. If you want a guide from someone who actually understands and plays the game well, you can check out the description for a document by Sush, which has a lot of information about switch hacks, progression sets and endgame sets up to TU5. For more updated sets, as mentioned before, I have linked my latest set guide in the description. Thanks again to Upgrade for theory crafting those. Only when you combine accurate mathematical optimization and extensive gameplay experience can you create a practical and effective meta set guide. Thanks for watching, and if you're a Protective Polish user, leave an angry comment and I'll reply telling you to go fuck yourself.